Alright, in this video, we're going to be reviewing the most popular dermatoscopes used by those of us working in dermatology, though many other specialties are starting to use them as well. But because we're focusing on the perspective of use by medical professionals, we're not going to get sidetracked with a deep discussion of the differences between polarized and non-polarized lighting, contact versus non-contact dermoscopy, etc. That is, we're going to assume that you're already familiar with these concepts. So with that clarified, these are the units that we're going to review: the Dermalite 100 or DL100, the Dermalite Carbon, the Dermalite GL, and the Lumio S, the four of which could be classified as low to mid-range dermatoscopes, at least as far as pricing goes. And then we'll round out the discussion with what may be considered the higher-end models, which are the DL200 Hybrid, the DL3, and then finally the flagship model, the DL4. But real quick, if you kind of already know which one you're leaning towards and you'd just like to skip ahead, look below this video as we've posted some links which will allow you to jump right to the section of the video which reviews that particular model. So let's get started with the DL100, which could be best described as Dermalite's budget or entry-level dermatoscope. And it's actually its budget friendliness which starts out the list of its good attributes. Although the suggested retail of the DL100 is just under $400, realistically, through dermatoscopes.com, you can pick one up for under $300. So with that in mind, the DL100 is by far the most affordable of the quality dermatoscopes on the market now. So if you're just starting out and you're within a budget, trust me when I say that the DL100 will do just about anything that you need for it to do when it comes to dermoscopy. Even though this is a relatively inexpensive unit, the image quality as seen through the lens is surprisingly sharp. Actually, here are a few examples, as these were taken directly through the DL100. And I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions about the DL100. That is, that since it's so inexpensive, that the lens quality must suffer. But as you can see, it really doesn't, as it does provide a well-lit, sharp image, allowing you to visualize fine details within the lesions that you're evaluating. But you may have noticed that a moment ago, I said that the DL100 will do just about anything that you need for it to do. Why did I make that distinction by saying just about? Well, so far as the lens goes, as clear as the image is, the lens itself is quite small, being only 15 millimeters in diameter. Now, just for a quick comparison, the top of the line DL4 has a lens which is twice as large at 30 millimeters, and the Lumio S has an even larger lens at 40 millimeters. Now, from a practical standpoint, for most of the lesions that you're seeing, it's a non-issue, but every now and then, a particularly large lesion will come in, and with those, it's possible that you won't be able to visualize the entire lesion within the field of view. But the question is it really necessary to see the entire lesion at once within the same view? Or when a large lesion comes in, is it instead okay to just scan through, evaluating what you can see, and then just move the dermatoscope slightly over to see the rest? I would argue that it's really not that big of a deal to do this, but everyone's preferences are different. Another downside to this smaller lens, which I would say is actually more important, is that you do need to get pretty close to the lens in order to see what you need to see. Now, while this may seem obvious, the truth is that the larger lensed dermatoscopes, like the DL4 or the Lumio S, they have such large lenses that they can afford you the luxury of not necessarily sticking your face right up to the lens. It sounds funny, but many of you likely know what I'm referring to. So far as how this can create an awkward situation, there are just certain times in which it would be preferable to not necessarily have your face within millimeters of the lesion that you're evaluating. Also, the DL100 does have far fewer LEDs as compared to the top of the line models, and the LEDs that it does have are polarized only. We'll go over that in just a second when we talk about the Carbon, but the main significance of this is that the DL100 is not the ideal dermatoscope if you're trying to evaluate very superficial features. We're talking dermatic lifts, lichenification, etc. To me, and I think most who evaluate the DL100, one of the greatest issues with the DL100 is the build quality. Now, I want to be as objective and as fair as I can be, but just to be honest, the DL100 feels inexpensive. I'm not trying to sound harsh, but it just kind of feels like cheap plastic. But does that necessarily translate into causing problems? Well, perhaps. I can tell you that I have personally used the DL100 as my primary dermatoscope for years, and for me, and I guarantee just about everyone who has used one in the clinic. Ask us the one thing that we don't like about it. And for many of us, it's the fact that if you drop the DL100 on the floor, this ring, as well as this polarized filter, will tend to pop out. And here's the deal. If you're a heavy user of your dermatoscope, as many of us are, it's not that uncommon to drop the dermatoscope and have it hit the floor. Even if you only drop it every few hundred patients that you see, you can imagine that adds up over the course of the year. And if and when you do drop it, it falls into pieces and you need to quickly reassemble it before seeing the next patient or continuing the current visit that you're on. That can be a little frustrating. Do it enough times and these pieces can break. Yes, you can order replacement pieces if needed, but still. So if overall sturdiness is near the top of your list of important characteristics you're looking for in a dermatoscope, just know the DL100 may not be for you. And finally, another feature which some consider to be a downside of the DL100 is that it's battery operated. It uses this type of camera battery, which you can order online or even pick up at the photo department within Walmart. For me personally, when I used the DL100, I kind of liked the fact that it was battery operated, because if and when the battery runs out, as long as you have an extra battery available, you just pop it in and you're ready to go, versus needing to charge the unit and wait. And in my experience, even with heavy use, the battery lasts for months. But of course, this means that you need to buy a new battery each time. They average a little under $10 each, which isn't too bad, but when you count up how many times you'll need to buy a new battery over the lifetime of the dermatoscope, it's just something to consider when taking into account the overall cost of ownership. So who should purchase the DL100? Well, with all of the factors mentioned, someone who, 1, is on a budget, as it can be purchased for under $300. 2, doesn't mind some of the trade-offs in lens size and build quality in exchange for the low price. Or, if 1 or 2 don't apply to you, 3, someone who's looking for a good backup dermatoscope. This is actually pretty important. We routinely receive emails from clinicians who are experiencing issues with their current dermatoscope, and they're contacting us to either inquire about service or to purchase a new one. But regardless of whether their current unit is sent in for service or they decide to purchase a new one, either option can leave them without a dermatoscope for at least a week or 2. And again, if you're like me, you've come to depend on your dermatoscope for doing exams all throughout the day, and not having one can really put you in a bind. So even if the DL100 does not represent your ideal dermatoscope, if you're a heavy user, and especially if there are multiple clinicians in the clinic who also have just one dermatoscope, you may want to consider buying one to simply keep in the clinic, to use as a backup when needed. Alright, the next unit we're going to discuss is the Dermlite Carbon, and you'll quickly see why we chose it to be next. And that's because it's essentially a DL100, but with linear polarization option. Now, I know we said at the beginning that we wouldn't get into a deep discussion of polarization, but just to be clear, linear polarization is a form of polarization which allows visualization of the surface, whereas cross-polarization is really what most of us think of when we think of polarization in dermatoscopes. In other words, it's the cross-polarization which allows us to visualize deeper at the level of the melanocytes without the use of oil for contact dermoscopy. So with that said, the Carbon is otherwise very similar in overall size, shape, and specs as compared to the DL100. In fact, you can hold them side by side and easily see this. But as mentioned, the Dermlite Carbon directly addresses one of the DL100's most significant disadvantages, or at least a disadvantage to some, which is the lack of surface visualization. By selecting from either of these 2 buttons on the Carbon, you can choose to view surface features, or you can look deeper, which is really how most of us spend 99% of our time when it comes to using dermoscopy for evaluating skin lesions, particularly pigmented skin lesions. But just to play devil's advocate, for many of us working in dermatology, most of us hardly, if ever, use the surface viewing features of our dermatoscopes. Instead, we're of course using these to look deeper in the skin, primarily at pigmented lesions, or other deeper changes associated with non-melanoma skin cancers like basal cell carcinomas. So in other words, one could argue that having the extra linear polarization option for surface viewing may not necessarily translate into greater functionality for the vast majority of your exams. Though I'm sure most of you know what I mean, let's just show an example. It's cool to see the very superficial lines and dramatic lifts, like we see here, but how often do we really need to do so in clinical practice? Generally not that often. So at least for me, and I think for many others, not being able to visualize superficially isn't necessarily a deal breaker. Also, if you recall, we talked about the relatively small lens diameter of the DL100. Well, the Carbon specs are similar. So if you're currently using a larger lensed dermatoscope, one which allows for a wider field of vision, particularly for larger lesions, and a greater working distance, which doesn't require you to stick your face right up to the dermatoscope and the patient. Well, if you're used to that, then you may need to still consider looking at other units. And similar to the DL100, another issue to take into account is the build quality. The Carbon does feel slightly sturdier than the DL100, but not by much. And the same issue of what can happen if you drop the unit is still a concern. That is, the issue of this filter in our tension ring popping out. And then finally, the battery is also similar to that of the DL100. It's not rechargeable, but instead needs to be replaced as needed. So who should purchase the DermLite Carbon? Honestly, I'd have to say that the Carbon is best for those who would have found themselves choosing the DL100, but hesitated when they discovered that its capabilities for visualizing surface features were limited. The specs are otherwise similar to the DL100, so in the end, that's the real deciding factor as to why you may choose the Carbon over the DL100. Next, let's talk about the DermLite GL. If I had to choose the one dermatoscope which really surprised me the most in this review, it would be the GL. And its quick description reflects that. The surprisingly capable, easy to carry, and user-friendly dermatoscope. To look at the GL, I don't know about you, but my first instinct was that this does not look like it could possibly be a serious dermatoscope. But once I had the chance to hold it in my hands and use it, I quickly came to appreciate its benefits. First, it's light and it's simple. And when you're talking about carrying something with you from room to room, seeing patients all day long, light is good. And while calling the GL simple may sound like a criticism, it really isn't. It does what it needs to do without making things complicated. Just for comparison, let's hold it next to another unit we'll be reviewing, the DL3. For as beautiful as the DL3 is, it's much heavier and bulkier. Now ask yourself, if this could do the job which you need it to do, is it really necessary to carry this around instead? Or here's another question, which would you rather drop on the floor? And don't say it won't happen, because it's going to happen. Eventually, you are going to drop your dermatoscope, not just once, but multiple times over its lifetime. And while my heart would skip a few beats if I were to drop the DL3, it wouldn't really be that big of a deal to drop the GL. It's much lighter and just doesn't have all of the moving parts of the much more complex units. And while instinctively these qualities would seem to translate into a poorer image quality, it really doesn't. The GL provides two lenses, one which magnifies at 1.4x and the other which magnifies at 6x, and each lens is surrounded by 4 bright LEDs as seen here. Although by comparison, 4 LEDs may not sound like much, trust me when I say that these are particularly bright. Again, brings us back to simplicity. Why have 16 LEDs if only 4 will do the job? But specs aside, here's what I'll tell you, in my opinion, is the primary strength of the GL. It's this. When I do a skin exam, and I would bet that many of you are the same, I constantly use the light from my dermatoscope to add illumination to the area of skin that I'm looking at, almost in a sweeping motion, seeing if anything jumps out at me. And if something does, I pause and take a quick look to see if it's truly concerning or a false alarm. And then only if it still remains a concern do I need to really pause and perform a closer exam. Many of you watching this likely perform a similar macroscopic to microscopic scanning process when doing skin exams, and the GL is great for this. And the lenses themselves are a good size, measuring 25mm for the 1.4x and 20mm for the 6x. As previously mentioned, these larger lenses allow you to easily visualize the lesion or other structure that you're examining without the need to place your eye right up to the lens, which again can be an issue with the smaller lenses found on the DL100 and the Carbon. And finally, unlike the first two units we've reviewed, the GL is rechargeable using a USB Type-C connector. So far as any downsides, first, it's worth remembering that the GL is designed to provide you with only what you need to see the vast majority of patients throughout the day. And in doing so, it provides those features in a light and compact unit. So the first downside is that it doesn't provide non-polarized or linear polarized lighting for very superficial evaluation. But again, as we've previously discussed, many of us find that we never use the surface lighting feature of our dermatoscopes, so not having it won't really affect us for 99% of the patient evaluations. Another downside, if you can call it that, is just the mental hurdle of having the confidence to believe that such a simple unit can do the job that you need it to do. Again, it just does not look like your typical dermatoscope, and for that reason, it's easy to dismiss its value. But beyond the lack of non-polarized lighting or the psychological aspect of being such a simple dermatoscope, I would have to choose the 6X lens as being the biggest of the real issues. Don't get me wrong, it's sufficient to closely examine the vast majority of lesions, but every now and then, you just want to pause and take a minute to look very, very closely at a questionable lesion. Most of the other units offer up to 10x magnification. And yes, for those lesions that you really want to take a closer look at, when comparing side by side, there is a difference between the 6x magnification offered by the GL and the 10x magnification offered by the others. But again, will it really make a difference in the clinic when it comes to deciding whether a lesion is suspicious enough to warrant a biopsy or not? Probably not. Instead, it matters more from an academic standpoint, as every now and then we just want to examine certain lesions as closely as we can. And in those situations, you may find yourself wanting the 10x magnification provided by the other units. So who should choose the Dermalite GL? I think the GL is best for those who are looking for an easy-to-carry, light, sturdy dermatoscope that doesn't require large pockets or a case to carry around. That is, something that you can carry with you all day long to see every patient, and you literally just slip it in your pocket when you're done. And only if you feel the need for greater magnification or non-polarized lighting would you need to pull out another device. But here's the deal. If your colleagues in the clinic have one of those other units which offers 10x magnification or non-polarized lighting, or you also have one, but you find yourself only pulling it out every now and then due to its size or its weight, then seriously, consider getting a GL to use as your carry-around dermatoscope, and then just pull out your larger device or borrow someone else's in the clinic only when needed. Next up is the Lumio S, which provides the largest lens found on a pocket dermatoscope. Let's just hold it up next to another unit. Doing so allows us to appreciate just how large the lens is on the Lumio S. It has a very large 40mm lens. Not only does this allow you to visualize all but the largest of lesions all at once within the same field of view, but the other advantage is the working distance that it provides as a result of its lens size. You may recall how I mentioned that with the DL100's relatively small lens, it requires you to place the dermatoscope very close to the lesion, and in turn, you also need to place your face very close to the dermatoscope in order to visualize the lesion within the lens. Not only can this be a little awkward depending on where the lesion is that you're evaluating, but if you've ever tried to mark up surgical borders with a dermatoscope, you understand how difficult it can be when you don't have much room to work with. Well, that's definitely one of the main advantages of the Lumio S. That is, that it's able to focus at a distance which still allows a marking pen to easily sneak in between the patient and the dermatoscope so that you can accurately mark up the margins that you're working with. Plus, it's bright, very bright, with a total of 32 polarized LEDs to illuminate the lesion, or alternatively, 8 non-polarized LEDs which can be turned on with the press of a button in order to visualize surface features. Another cool feature is that the lens is protected on either side with Corning Gorilla Glass, similar to what's placed on many smartphones. This protective glass, along with its simple, solid design, feels good in the hand and doesn't cause concern for being fragile or easily prone to breaking in case it were to be dropped. And so far as recharging, doing so is easy with its micro USB connection. And finally, its size adds to its stability. This can be particularly helpful when you're trying to hold it in one hand, but your other hand is staying busy, such as when you're trying to mark up surgical margins. Some of the more compact units, like the DL4, one could argue that its thinner handle, although comfortable, doesn't feel quite as stable when performing tasks such as delineating lesion margins. But it's the size of the Lumio S, which for some tops the list of negatives. That is, people seem to either love it or hate it. In other words, for some, it's a little too large, at least when it comes to carrying around from room to room. And personally, I would have to agree. Here we'll hold up the DL4 for comparison, and right away, you can see the difference. Also, the lens, for as large and illuminated as it is only 4x, and many of you are already used to 10x magnification as found in many of the other units. But again, as we touched upon when discussing the GL, the question is, do we really need 10x for most situations? I would argue no, and that for most patients, even as low as 4x is plenty, at least for the majority of lesions. But for those of you who are used to 10x, it may leave you wanting more. So who is the Lumio S right for? I'd have to say it has two niches. First would be those who have tried other dermatoscopes and just find themselves wishing that the lens were larger. At 40 millimeters, the Lumio S simply has the largest lens that you'll expect to find on a modern pocket dermatoscope. And the second niche, I believe, is for those who use a dermatoscope in the surgical dermatology setting. As we've mentioned, its working distance allows for easy use when marking out lesion margins, and the 4x magnification is plenty for doing not only that, but also for routine screening purposes. But without a belt clip and given its size and weight, again, I'm just not sure that most clinicians would want to carry it around on them from room to room throughout the day. And for those needing a dermatoscope for routine skin exams, especially if you're in a high-volume clinic, those every now and then lesions which require greater scrutiny, you may find yourself wanting more than just 4x magnification when it comes to those. Alright, let's move on to the DL200 Hybrid. The DL200 is definitely a customer favorite, which provides a great balance of features. So far as which features make it so popular, let's just quickly take a look at it. Does anything in particular stand out to you? Similar to the Lumio, most would say it's the lens, which is the first thing that catches their eye. The DL200 has a large 25mm lens, which provides some of that working distance advantage that we previously discussed with the other units that have larger lenses. And so far as lighting goes, it has plenty. The DL200 Hybrid has 15 polarized LEDs, while 6 non-polarized LEDs can be turned on with a tap of a button, allowing you to evaluate surface structures in more detail. And speaking of lights, just a quick fact. Some of you may have noticed that there's also a DL200HR available, which looks a lot like the DL200 Hybrid. And as a result, you may wonder what's the difference. Well, the lighting is the only difference. The DL200 Hybrid is the unit that we're reviewing in detail here, and the hybrid in its name represents the fact that it has both polarized and non-polarized lighting. But the DL200HR, it's the same dermatoscope except for the fact that it only has polarized lighting. So if you know you really don't care to review surface features, which is something we've already talked about a few times in this review video, yet you like all of the other features of the DL200 Hybrid, and you wouldn't mind saving a little bit of money, then the DL200HR is, again, the exact same dermatoscope except that it doesn't have the non-polarized lighting available. Another advantage of the DL200 line is this glass faceplate that extends with the turn of a dial, allowing you to perform contact dermoscopy. Again, we're assuming that you already have some familiarity with the advantages and disadvantages of contact dermoscopy, so we won't get too sidetracked. But the bottom line is that if you do like to have that option available to use oil to perform contact dermoscopy from time to time, the DL200 may be right for you. And just as a side note, Dermlite does offer disposable covers called ice caps, which can allow you to use the contact dermoscopy feature, but when done, you simply dispose of the cap. This can make the process both safer and easier for those who perform contact dermoscopy. And finally, it is rechargeable using a micro USB connection. So what's not to like? Well, let me say that you know you're dealing with a good dermatoscope when it's hard to find many negatives, and that's the case with the DL200. I'd have to say that the first would be the price. Now that we're talking about these higher-end dermatoscopes, we're dealing with units whose prices are starting around the $1,000 mark. Though for this unit, on sites like ours at dermatoscopes.com, you can pick one up for just under $900. But still, it does make the point that the DL200 is really the first of what we would consider the higher-end dermatoscopes that we're reviewing in this video, all three of which are at or break the $1,000 price point. But, as with everything, quality does come at a price. It's also worth mentioning, and we're going to make up a phrase here, but some may find that the overall size, weight, and shape is perhaps not as carry with you for every patient that you see friendly as other more compact units. Again, I just think about walking with it from room to room, seeing patients all day long, and as compared to the smaller or lighter units, some may find that it's just not as ideal for doing so. It doesn't come with a belt pouch, though one is available for purchase. But if you don't normally wear a belt, you may find that it's a little heavy or bulky to keep in your pocket throughout the day. So who is the DL200 best suited for? Put simply, the DL200 is perfect for those looking for a well-rounded dermatoscope. That is, it really strikes a balance with what it offers. Price-wise, it's definitely not the cheapest, but nor is it the most expensive. For lens size, it's not the largest, but it is certainly larger than most. And overall size and weight, again, not the lightest or smallest, but nor is it the largest and heaviest unit out there. But even though it's not the largest and the heaviest, I will go ahead and add, I do think that it would be better for those who A, wear a belt, and B, purchase the available belt pouch. Of course, it could also be carried around in your lab coat pocket as well. But I do believe that its size and weight would make it a bit too large and uncomfortable to carry around in slacks or dress pants, just in case that's what you normally find yourself wearing during the day. Alright, let's talk about the DL3. We're going to describe the DL3 as the Rolls-Royce of dermatoscopes. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, if it's the Rolls-Royce, that must mean it's the best, right? Well, to some, yes, but there are plenty of people who would find a Rolls-Royce to be not only too nice, but also too large, too heavy, and too impractical for everyday driving. So let's talk about what I mean, starting with the good. First, and above all, the DL3 just exudes quality. It just feels like a finely crafted instrument. I would argue more than any other dermatoscope out there. It features a beautiful 25mm lens, and it has an extendable faceplate, which allows you the option to perform contact dermoscopy with oil, or without extending the faceplate, non-contact dermoscopy without oil. But even more unique is the lighting. Not only is the amount of lighting impressive, with a total of 28 LEDs built in, but the DL3 as well as the DL4, which we'll talk about in just a moment, both feature 3Gen's Pigment Boost technology. What the Pigment Boost technology offers is the addition of orange lighting, which provides a warmer illumination as compared to traditional all-white LEDs. Here are some images for comparison. To be clear, of all of the dermatoscopes that we're reviewing here today, only the DL3N and the DL4 offer the Pigment Boost option. So if it's so well crafted, like a Rolls-Royce as we say, what might there be not to like about the DL3? Well, first, it is a bit expensive. The full retail price is around $1,100, though on dermatoscopes.com you can pick one up for just under $1,000. But even more direct to the Rolls-Royce comparison. Just as a Rolls-Royce is extremely well built and luxurious, many drivers would find them to be too large and heavy for everyday use. In other words, a Rolls-Royce is the kind of car that you use when you're going out to a nice dinner or another formal event. But to just run out to the grocery store, not so much. And the DL3, as strange as this comparison sounds, just kind of gives off that same vibe. It's a finely engineered instrument that just feels like it needs to be treated carefully and with respect, rather than just pulled out and used on every patient. Also like a Rolls-Royce, it's heavy. Now I should clarify, it's actually about the same weight as the Lumio S and the DL200. However, the DL3 just feels heavier, and I think part of the reason is because it's not as balanced. Whereas the DL200 and the Lumio distribute their weight fairly evenly across the device, the DL3 is disproportionately heavy here and weighs very little here. But is that really a big deal? Maybe not for many people. But if you prefer a balanced feel in your hand, just know that the DL3 may not be for you. What else? Well, again, this is subjective, but I personally don't find it to be the most pocket-friendly. In other words, its size, shape, and weight doesn't lend itself very well to just throwing it into your pants pocket or lab coat. Now, it does come with a belt pouch, which personally I would use if this were to be my everyday dermatoscope. But I'm a guy and I wear belts. But if you don't routinely wear belts, it's just something that you need to keep in mind. Also, another important feature worth mentioning is that it requires its own proprietary charging base. Don't get me wrong, some people like this, as it's elegant and well built. But again, making the comparison to Rolls-Royce, or really any luxury car if you've ever owned one, generally you can't just take them down the street to the mechanic. They have to be serviced in their own unique service center. Now, I know these comparisons sound strange, but that's also how I feel the DL3 is with its charging base. It can only be charged in this particular base. For me personally, I like the versatility that comes with being able to simply plug in your typical USB cable that you probably have already laying around for your phone or other devices. The concern being that if anything happens and this base quits working, well then you have to wait until you order and receive a replacement. Now, is that likely to be an issue? Probably not, as we don't receive many orders for replacement bases, but it's just something to consider. So who would be a good fit for the DL3? In my mind, there are two types of people for whom the DL3 would be ideal. The first would be someone who, above all, wants a high-end, finely tuned precision dermatoscope and doesn't mind some of the trade-offs discussed, such as the size, weight, need for its own charging base, etc. Or, and to me, this is really the ideal scenario, someone who primarily relies on a lighter, more practical dermatoscope like the GL for most patient exams, but then only brings out the DL3 when a particularly suspicious lesion needs to be evaluated more closely, with better lighting and magnification. As you've probably gathered by my comments so far, I just personally wouldn't want to carry and use the DL3 on every patient that I see. But it's such a nice instrument with an excellent lens and crystal clear focus and wonderful lighting, including the Pigment Boost technology. Personally, I just think that having something like the GL would be great for routine exams to carry around with you all day long, but then combine it with a high-end unit like the DL3 to keep in the office to only be pulled out when needed. And finally, that brings us to the last model we'll be reviewing here, the DL4. The quick description of the DL4 is easy, as many consider it Dermlight's flagship dermatoscope. So what's so great about it? Well, there's no point in repeating what's already been said, so let me just say this. The DL4 literally has all of the good features of the DL3, of the lens quality, size, lighting, Pigment Boost technology, and overall build quality, but directly addresses some of the drawbacks of the DL3. That is, first, it just feels more compact and solid. And I mean that specifically in reference to how the DL3 feels like a luxurious, finely crafted instrument, but yet which also feels like it needs to be handled with care. Don't get me wrong, you still don't want to just throw around the DL4, but at least for me, it just feels a little bit more solid and a little bit more rugged, at least so far as how it would make you feel carrying it around with you all day long. And part of the reason, I believe, is because overall it just feels better in the hand. Interestingly, it's actually just slightly heavier than the DL3, but its weight is distributed more evenly, and it just doesn't have that lopsided, heavier on one side feeling that we mentioned with the DL3. Also, its handle is more ergonomic. Just comparing the DL3 in the hand as compared to the DL4, you can see what I mean. It's just easier and more comfortable to hold, and even comes with this silicone sleeve which adds to its comfort. I also find that it's a bit easier to operate with one hand, again because of its weight distribution, size, and ergonomics. It's also slightly more versatile with regard to the Pigment Boost feature. That is, whereas the DL3 does offer Pigment Boost, its Pigment Boost lighting is only available in addition to the white LED lighting. However, the DL4 offers Pigment Boost lighting both in addition to the white LEDs, as well as having a standalone option to use only the orange Pigment Boost lighting. Now, are there many scenarios in which viewing a lesion with only the orange Pigment Boost lighting will make a difference? Maybe, maybe not, but at least the option is there. So what's not to like? Well, just being honest, for many people, it's the price. It's the most expensive unit we're reviewing here, with a suggested retail price of $1,395. But as with the other dermatoscopes, on our website, we do offer them for a fair amount less. But discounted or not, it does take a little bit of getting used to when you haven't yet purchased a high-end dermatoscope whose price tops out over $1,000. Besides the price, I would have to say that it does share some of the not-so-pocket-friendly issues of the DL3. Again, it's overall more compact as compared to the DL3, but if you aren't using its belt pouch and instead have to rely on keeping it in your lab coat or pants pocket, you may still find it to be a bit bulky or awkward to carry around. So who is the DL4 ideally suited for? Simply put, if you want what many consider to be the single best overall handheld dermatoscope out there, and you don't mind paying for that quality, then you really can't go wrong with the DL4. However, I would add that it really is best for those who routinely wear belts and are able to use its belt pouch. If you don't routinely wear a belt or even have a lab coat, I do think that you may find it a little bit big or bulky to simply carry in your pants pocket. And over time, you may find that you're not carrying it around with you as much as you'd like to. In those situations, a much lighter unit like the Dermlight GL would be a good option, even if paired up with the DL4 to keep on hand in case you do need something with greater magnification. So there we have it. We've covered quite a bit of information here, and if you'd like to download what's essentially a cheat sheet of what we've discussed, including the most important specs of each model, check out the link below this video. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube and you have any questions, just comment below, and we'll do our best to monitor any comments and respond in a timely manner. Alternatively, feel free to reach out to us by email at contact@dramatiscopes.com. Thanks, and don't forget to share this video with any colleagues who may be interested in learning more.